start now. Yeah, welcome to the 26th episode of the India Studies webinar series that we have been running at Flame University since 2021. And today we have the pleasure of inviting Professor Ezra Reshkow, all the way from Montclair State University in New Jersey, my ex-home state, where I lived more than a decade ago. And his topic is going to be based on his books, one of the chapters of his books, latest book, The Nature of Endangerment in India, published by I'll start with reading his bio, and then I'll invite him to take over. All right. So, Professor Ezra Reshkow, he is an associate professor of history at Montclair State University in New Jersey, USA. Before joining the faculty at Montclair, he completed his PhD and a teaching fellowship at SOAS in University of London, then held a position at the University of Virginia as lecturer in modern South Asian history, as well as publishing a number of articles on modern South Asian history, world environmental history, and the history of colonial anthropology. He has published two books, the co-edited Memory, Identity, and the Colonial Encounter in India, Essays in Honor of Peter Robb with Routledge in 2017, and the latest monograph, The Nature of Endangerment in India, Tigers, Tribes, Extermination, and Conservation, 1818 to 2020, Oxford University Press, 2023. He's currently working on his next book, A Global History of Efforts to Conserve Indigenous and Tribal Cultures within National Parks and Other Protected Areas, tentatively titled People, Parks, Histories of Preserving Inhabited Wilderness. Much of his work engages with the experiences of indigenous peoples in modernity and global debates over the relationship between biological and cultural diversity. In particular, the concept of endangerment has become a unifying strand throughout his body of work to date. His research thus explores historical discourses and policies that project biological and cultural diversity as similarly endangered and in need of similar or simultaneous forms of conservation. In Western and Central India, he collects oral histories of Bhil, Gond, Baiga, Kurku, and other conservation and or development-induced displacement. He then situates these oral histories in dialogue with the colonial archive, anthropological accounts, and activist engagements with these communities' histories. All right, very intriguing and very innovative, and I'm sure we are all ready for his really innovative take on this extremely important topic from an environmental perspective. Welcome, Professor Ezra Reshkow, all yours.
Okay, thank you, Pankaj. Thank you so much for inviting me and for introducing me. It's great to be here speaking at Flame University, not quite, I am at home in the US currently, but anyway, wonderful to be here. Let me share my screen. Hopefully that will happen quickly. And then let you see everybody see the cover of the book for those who haven't seen it yet. This is the book, The Nature of Endangerment in India, as you said. Really, the book is about the concept or nature.
You can make it full screen, Ezra. We see.
Oh, is it not? Is it not full screen?
No, not yet. Yeah, much better. Yeah, even more now. Slideshow. Please click on slideshow now.
This is slideshow mode.
Oh, no, this is...
That's not... I don't know what you see. To me, it looks full screen. What?
No, it's very small, so switch to other one.
Is that?
Yeah, better. A little better.
Okay. I'm not really sure why it's not full screen. Well,
click on swap displays. I think here I see, here there is a link, there is an icon on top. Swap displays or use slideshow, try that. On the left side. On the
left side.
Yeah,
swap display.
Yeah, that's better, I think. Yeah.
Okay, that's better. Okay. Okay, fine. Okay, so let me begin. The nature of endangerment, as I was saying, the concept of endangerment, and obviously the related concept of extinction as well. And so the book really begins at a kind of global level, thinking about concepts writ large, and then eventually zooms in on the Indian situation. And the last few chapters conclude with some very specific case studies from field work and archival work that I'd been doing in Western and Central India, as you mentioned, with Bhil and Gond and Baiga communities. In this case today, I really want to get to that field work and that archival work and spend the majority of the time. I've been asked to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. So Pankaj, if you can help me, please keep to that time, that would be great. But by at least, 10 minutes into this or so, 15 minutes into this or so, I'd like to be getting to talking about the experience specifically around Kanha National Park and Baiga Chowk in what's today Eastern Madhya Pradesh. But first, let me start off by giving you a very kind of as succinct as possible overview as I can of some of the major arguments and themes of the book. And in some sense, I would say one of the routes in, one of the ways it began was with this observation that I had about really a pretty problematic discourse. I might even call it a kind of toxic discourse, way of looking at Indigenous peoples and framing the experience. And by the way, I didn't really say yet that the real topic of the book in some sense is this idea of tribal endangerment discourse, that tribal or indigenous peoples are under threat with vanishing and disappearing, are endangered in various ways, in particular with extinction, of course, tribal extinction, right? And so one of the problematic or toxic ways, as I've said, of talking about this is a kind of dehumanizing discourse that equates these indigenous peoples with endangered species, with non-human species, and makes this sort of direct comparison, right, between endangered peoples and endangered animals, and basically sees the tribes as another kind of endangered species. And these are communities who have historically suffered the brunt of all kinds of racist, dehumanizing discourses. And so to directly compare them to animals this way, like to take this, Mursi Ethiopian warrior and try to say he's like I don't know, a turtle or something ridiculous, like in these two parallel book covers. This is a problem really of kind of simplifying and reducing this discourse for Western audiences and urban audiences, or what have often been called weird audiences, Western educated, industrialized, rich, and developed audiences. Weird is the acronym there. And, so there's a primitivizing of the tribal here, a romanticizing often that's going on. And so it kind of began as a critique of these kind of inflammatory images and ways of, vanishing tribes, Roy Pinney, by the author of Vanishing Wildlife. Again, vanishing tribes, primitive man on earth. These, a real reduction of any kind of intellectual effort to understand what's really happening in these communities. Again, often just to all about the imagery. Here was an older version of this from Bernhard Zimmek, a German filmmaker. Kein Platz für wilde Tiere literally means no place for wild animals, of course, featuring a young African girl in the center of the black and white image of on the left, and then a later 1980s spin-off of that, no place for wild people, kein Platz für wilde Menschen, literally just calling these people wild people. And the idea of trial wildness or primitivity itself is often seen as what's disappearing in this discourse. And so what I really want to stress here is not that I myself am either saying that the tribals, so-called in India, Adivasis of India, are not endangered. Um, it began mostly as a critique of a particular way of expressing that concern. Again, in this overly romanticized and stylized type of pseudo-anthropological work by people like Jimmy Nelson. Before they pass away, he set off to supposedly capture images of all these endangered communities before, they would be lost forever to posterity, and he had to preserve them photographically, of course, posing them and staging these images in the most dramatic landscapes and in their traditional garb. So really not anthropological work at all, but more like in the vein of Edward Curtis from the early 20th century, who captured shot these photos of the so-called vanishing Indian in the lower right, sort of wandering off into the sunset, and erased the alarm clock that you can see in the image on the upper right in order to create an aura of tribal authenticity. So, a mode of photography that had long been subject to critique by anthropologists and art historians. And so, again, this is by no means to question or deny the reality of indigenous genocide that has happened, especially in places like the New World, where I'm currently located, and in places like Australia. But it is also to observe that, and one of the first things that I noticed as a historian studying the history of this kind of tribal endangerment and extinction discourse, is that it existed from the very outset or very first moment of the colonial encounter. And so this is one of the key historical arguments here, that really tribal endangerment discourse existed almost parallelly and as long as tribal extinction or eradication discourse. So at the very first moment of the kind of beginnings of the outset of the colonial encounter, when Columbus just travels to what's was called then Hispaniola in the Caribbean, and meets the indigenous Taino population, and there is this horrible, bloodshed in this encounter that immediately produces resistance and activist voices, you might say. For example, Bartolome de las Casas, 1516, gets declared protector of Indians right there in the same place, and begin to advocate for the protection of this vanishing Indian race, as he put it. And for centuries, Las Casas was seen in European sources as trying to save the extinct indigenous peoples from vanishing and trying to protect them from extinction. And those were actually the words that were used. Extinction was being used in sources from the 16 and 1700s. And so this idea of indigenous vanishing, endangerment, extinction existed long before there was ever any equivalent awareness of the extinction of non-human species, of non-human animal species, tigers, let's say, in the Indian context, right? And so the argument is essentially that human endangerment discourse, especially endangerment and extinction discourse around indigenous peoples, came long before any kind of idea about saving wildlife. In fact, the term wildlife itself is really just a product of the 20th century. And it's really not until the early 19th century, mid-19th century, that there is a concept or awareness in the scientific community that non-human animal species could even become extinct, right? There's a long history of that with the discovery of dinosaur fossils, etc. And eventually, it's really, the extinction concept only starts to get embraced around the time of Darwin. And Darwin himself, it's often famously been argued that he very much understood genocide before he understood extinction, and that he drew his theory of extinction from um, excuse me, social realities, essentially, and very much based his extinction concept on social realities and like genocide. And so anyway, that's sort of a brief overview of the global issue. Now, in the Indian context, there's some variables, I guess you could say, or some factors that really make the case unique. And one of the big issues is around the concept, I mean, around the issue of naming and just the whole question of who or what the so-called tribals or tribes of India are, the indigenous peoples of India are. The issue of identity politics is a huge one. And so in the Indian context, as most, I assume, of this audience would know, these communities often self-refer as Adivasi, right? Or literally meaning indigenous, Adi, first, Vasi, inhabitant. But just to get a little political for a moment, many on the Hindu right would say, there's nobody more indigenous in India than Hindus. It's offensive to say that we weren't here first and that some other community came before us, and go beyond that. They will also say, Adivasis are Hindus, and so this whole question of whether a unique religion, Adivasi religions, are being lost along with culture, kind of gets caught up in that. And of course, some could argue that Hindutva is eradicating unique, individual, small-scale tribal religious traditions, and others would, just the way you might say that, well, missionaries, Christian missionaries were saying we have to save the tribes, and the way we're going to save them is save their souls by converting them to Christianity or something. And so just to get back to this issue of Hindutva a little bit, many on the Hindu right would also say that the appropriate label, therefore, for these communities is Vanvasi, that the essential thing about them is that they were or are living in forests. And so this also leads to the point that many, I think, also on the left hold or believe that the way to save these tribes is to save them in nature. And the essential thing about what is being lost about these communities is their nature-based way of life, their life in the forest, their ecological traditions, and their traditional ecological livelihoods are being lost. And it's not necessarily the demographic issue. They're not necessarily demographically under threat. Their populations are strong. I mean, in fact, when we're talking about the Bhil and the Gond, we're talking about combined over something like 30 million people, and these populations are huge, really kind of heterogeneous umbrella identities, you might say, populations that have only been growing in various ways. You can kind of lump and split these communities in various ways as well. And also when it comes to the Baiga community has also really grown over the course of the 20th century quite healthily. And they are demographically, I would say, not under any significant threat of actual extinction. And so then this parallel between endangered species and endangered tribes also starts to break down, because if we're not actually talking about physical disappearance in the Indian context of these communities, what are we talking about? And so then it gets into, and so then this parallel that unfortunately we see so often in, I'm going to jump a couple slides here, in the Indian media, things like tiger, like tribal, and consistently drawing the parallel between wildlife and wild tribes, as in the old colonial discourse, really begins to break down, because it's not really a direct parallel at all. So it's not tiger culture that is being lost. So anyway, let me go back a little bit and talk for a second about methods. And these are images of the Mundla District Record Room. It's an incredible wealth of archival material here. So let me just suggest anybody who's really interested in local history, the districts all across, India, central India, are full of such rooms of revenue records and land records, tax details, going back into the colonial period, more than any one researcher could ever begin to work through. This is an image on the left of me, my first visit there in 2005. As a young man, almost 20 years ago. I've been doing archival research all around the world, really, since the time I began my PhD back then. I was doing field work in India, 2005 and 6 in Madhya Pradesh. I've been back to Kanha multiple times, and to Baigachak multiple times since then, 2005, 2015, 16, etc. And so I've been collecting archival histories, also in all the major archives in Bhopal and Delhi and London, but more importantly, in some sense, for this project, collecting oral history fieldwork in various areas of Western and Central India, talking to Adivasi communities themselves about how they understand the health and of their own communities and cultures. And in particular, I focused on sites where these communities have suffered from conservation and development-induced displacement. So here on the left is a map of Kanha National Park in eastern Madhya Pradesh, as I've mentioned, where so many villages and households have been resettled outside of the park. And I've also done field work in places like in the Narmada Valley and Pachmarhi, so all along the Narmada Valley, really. So this issue of tribal endangerment discourse is really extremely strong in activists fighting displacement, right? So one of the ways in which they can sort of rally support, especially support of urban audiences in Bombay and Delhi and urban and global audiences, is to tell supporters that the tribes are endangered and they're under threat of extinction, and they need to be saved. And they need to be saved by you, white saviors. Come on in and help save the tribes. And so this kind of thing, is something that I have to admit I was really exposed to myself as a young man growing up in the U.S. It's a kid growing up in the U.S. You would hear from activist organizations that the tribes are endangered, that they're under threat. You have to save them. We have to do something. And so before I knew anything about, details of the situations really of these communities, who they were, what they were, I had some sort of, missionary impulse being instilled in me by activist organizations that you should go and do something, that you should come and help. And so I have to admit that when I got to the field, for the first time around this period that I mentioned before, 2005 or so. I was in for quite a surprise back then, because what I started to hear from communities and what I started to see on the ground is quite different, I felt, from what some of the activists were telling me and what some of the discourse looked like. Many of the people that I spoke with said that they were sick of living in a remote rural village that had no roads, no electricity, no access to hospitals or schools. That they would do anything just to have a road to their village, so in case of emergency, they could get their grandfather to hospital or something like that. And others said that they were, eager. Some said that, and this is, I wasn't conducting a quantitative survey here. There were a variety of voices. Often there were distinctions between older and younger generations, for example, with older folks who had been resettled, yearning for what they lost in the forest and the patrimony, their the heritage, what they grew up with, etc. But anyway, the thing that the other map here on the right is of an area just east of Kanha National Park called Baigachak. And Baigachak was an area established in this part of central India all the way back in the 1870s, just a decade or so after the central provinces themselves were founded. And Baigachak was an area that there's some debate really about what its purpose was and what its goal was. It was a kind of tribal reservation, you can say, or a tribal reserve for the Baiga community, where the Baiga were allowed to practice their traditional, what's often called slash and burn cultivation method, often known as Jum in the pan-Indian context. There are other, the Gond community, neighboring Gond communities practice what was called Daya cultivation. The Baiga's method itself was called Bevar. Many of you probably know that as well. And this was an area where the colonial administration attempt to stop the practice of this slash and burn agricultural method throughout the region. They allowed it to continue. And so there are various arguments in the colonial archive about the purpose of this block, let's say, or chalk, this reservation. Some, Verrier Elwin, for example, argued that it was an attempt to lock the Baiga into a ring fence and keep them from spreading beyond. And there was an attempt to curb and curtail their traditional agricultural method. But others, really argued that this was a place to kind of save Baiga culture and to save Baiga agriculture. And from the 1880s, more the 1890s onwards, this sort of protectionist discourse amongst colonial administrators grew louder and louder, and until it kind of culminated in the 1930s and 40s discourse that people like Verrier Elwin engaged in, that really called for saving the Baiga tribe, and that this place was the place to do it. So in this chapter, chapter 6 of the book, which is the final chapter of my book, I look at Verrier Elwin's book, The Baiga, and published in 1939. And as a kind of historical center point in this history of tribal conservation or preservation attempts in central India. In that book, he calls for the creation of, quote, a sort of national park for the Gond and Baiga in this part of eastern central India, and essentially says that the way to save the tribes is to create a protected area for them, and that in that space they should be allowed to, continue their traditional hunting methods, traditional farming methods, that they should be kept undisturbed from unwanted influences of modernity and development. And so this immediately elicited, massive critique from sociologists such as Guria, who argued that that Elwin wanted to be a kind of anthropological dictator, and that he wanted to keep the tribes in a kind of a museum or a zoo, and to keep them as they were, and to not allow them to develop. And so my point here is not a kind of to rehash the Guria-Elwin debates of the mid-20th century, but to point out that that was just one historical moment in a long history of such debates about the fate of the tribes, going back, as I've mentioned earlier, to the very outset of the colonial encounter, and continuing to the present, to this day. So the question of what was Baigachak, was it a kind of national park to save the Baiga culture, or was it a reformatory to undermine it? What is sort of similar in my mind to the whole issue of what these scheduled districts were in the 1870s as well, and the whole issue of reservations around what scheduled tribes are. And so the chapter kind of explores a lot of these issues and draws some parallel to the Indian Forest Act of the 1870s, to the Scheduled District Act that came about in the same period, and suggests that there were sort of similar or parallel attempts to conserve forests, and to problematically also conserve tribal cultures in this period. Both tendencies, developed over time and changed over time, and took on different expressions at different periods. But to talk about some of the contemporary stuff, this discourse very much continues to this day. The Hindu newspaper is actually full of a lot of them. Gond culture faces threat. Is Gond culture fading into oblivion? But it also continues in, sorry, just one second. Oops, I lost my, why did I do that? Hindi language media with hashtags like Vilup Prajati, say extinct species, to refer to these tribal communities. You have on the upper left here, instead of reading the Hindi, I'll just briefly kind of like translate a couple of things. I mean, you have Prakrit Bachao, Adivasi Bachao, save nature, save the tribes, as a hashtag as well. In the lower right, again, the tribes, the Baiga being called an extinct species, and this individual calling on a Mantri, calling on a excuse me, an MP to get involved and help, save the tribes. And so perhaps, again, it highlighted text, not just tigers, indigenous communities, the Baiga's survival is endangered, and the ecologist, and this perhaps nothing as extreme as in the discourse by Survival International, which carries this kind of romanticizing, infantilizing discourse to its sort of ultimate end, reducing the Bhil and Gond to the status of a Disney Jungle Book character, saying Mowgli's being kicked out of Kanha National Park, and his jungle is now a tiger reserve, but tourists are welcome. And, in other advertising campaigns, turning the Dongria Khan into, white people wearing literally wearing blue face, dressed up as space aliens to represent these endangered tribal communities that have to be saved by you and I, right? And so, again, this is not necessarily to speak about the status of the communities that I've worked with myself, but I'd like to say a little bit about that as well. And so what I did find coming to Kanha and to other parts of central and western India is really vibrant Adivasi political movements, and movements fighting for rights and recognition, movements that did not rely necessarily on the same endangerment discourse, except often when expressing it to their, status to outside audiences. I mean, their fights were absolutely for land rights, Jal Jungle and Zameen type stuff. But they, there were really vibrant political organizations, as I said, such as this celebration of Birsa Munda Jayanti, or his birthday, and thousands and thousands of people gathering in such settings to stand up, to elect local representation into government, to put MPs into power, to affect real change. And so the question of what is endangered really, comes up here. But, one of the things that I noticed traveling around was a lot of organization around the Gondwana movement, actually a fight for a whole kind of separate state for Adivasis in this part of central India, in Madhya Pradesh. And a lot of Baradev, of course, being one of the main Gond deities, paraphernalia as well. And, the flags of Gondwana were flying over many households, and multicolored striped flag, which I don't have an image of here. And when I visited what is often, what are often known as resettlement colonies, resettlements, what I found was people were combining their, each adult over 18 would receive about 10 lakh rupee, 10 lakh rupee, and they would get, families would pool together this money, and they'd build quite large, impressive houses. This one in brown in the upper left is one that is just finishing up construction, nearing finishing construction. The one in the upper right this is just outside of Kanha, is one that was completed a couple of years ago. And you can see sort of how a very similar construction style. It's developed, and the people there have land, they're cultivating, they have access to tube wells, and they're pumping water, and they're being quite successful agriculturally. The in the lower left is also a house that was resettled outside, just into the out of the core of the national park, and you can see that they're growing traditional, cultivation on their rooftop. The image on the lower right, I think, is interesting. This was built by a man who wanted to get out of the park before his village was ever asked to resettle. He approached the forest department and specifically requested that they move him individually. I guess I don't really know what his issues were with his, fellow villagers or whatever, that he wanted to leave his village. But he, you know, built a modern concrete construction quite close to a major highway, has access to all sorts of modern amenities, and I was very pleased to get out. Now, that is not the only, there is definitely stories of people who've been twice and thrice displaced, who have are very frustrated with where they end up, whether there's because there's no water in their to cultivate their fields, and the agricultural land is bad for various reasons, or because they don't have jobs, because they just have nostalgia and miss the forest. People are not always happy, right? But then there's the question of what aspects of their culture are endangered, what is being lost in this process as well. And there's a whole series of anthropological debates we could have there. But visiting Baigachak in particular, I met this one gentleman, for example, who is growing probably 100 different varieties of kodong and cookie, indigenous varieties of millets and bevar patches, practicing traditional agricultural methods. And he was actually featured in a kind of agro-biodiversity calendar. Unfortunately, I don't have an image of that calendar there. In the same village, sitting around the fire one evening, I met one of these women who was a dance instructor, and she started telling me that she actually had authored a book about Baiga Geet, or Baiga music and dance, and was teaching the younger generation how to make the traditional costumes and perform the traditional dances. And actually, both of these individuals that I met, who were actively engaged in cultural preservation, you might say, were some of the most clear voices also expressing concern about cultural endangerment or extinction, about the loss of Bevar, about how the younger generation aren't learning the traditional dance. And so what I found it interesting is it was usually activists, if anybody, who were the ones who were really clearly expressing these kinds of concerns about endangerment and extinction of culture and tradition. And the general population typically didn't, or at least not as clearly, see their culture as endangered. So let me just conclude. I don't really know how I'm doing for time, Pankaj, if I'm okay, but just last couple of thoughts. Sort of a bridge from this story of the dance instructor. One day in Baigachak, I found myself in a village where there was a traditional Baiga Dussara celebration happening. It was a wonderful, beautiful celebration that started the partying, the dancing started around midnight the night before, and people were dancing through the night. Everybody in their traditional costumes. And what stuck out to me, one person that stuck out to me was this young lady who was filming everything on a couple of different mobile devices. And let me see if I can just play a quick video clip here. Like the girls hitting each other there in the right of the screen as well. Men dancing on the left. So, there are different ways we can read these images and videos. One is, oh, there's this stupid American Westerner there with a big video camera in the middle of this dance performance and, interfering with local culture and tradition. And, just kidding, sort of. But and another is, oh, something about the girl and her video recordings and modernity and tradition or something as well. I mean, another could be about the fact that this is happening in Baigachak, and so is Baigachak doing the job of cultural preservation? Another could simply be, oh, look at this beautiful, vibrant dance performance. Well, what that's happening in a village, what does that have to do with forests and forest-based ways of life? Could that happen in a city as well? I remember in visiting one resettlement colony, so-called in the Narmada, and seeing traditional dances after or around a wedding. An anthropologist friend turned to me and said, jokingly, "See, here are your endangered tribals," somehow implying, like in the Verrier Albin mode, that the tribe that dances together keeps its culture preserved as well, and somehow that dance equals culture, and that's the only thing about it. But there's so many different levels of this and so many different ways to think about it. It's certainly much more complicated than any simple parallel equating endangered tribes and species or tigers and tribals, the way it's often simplistically done in social media. And so anyway, I just want to stress that my job here has not been to say whether Adivasi communities are or not endangered, but simply critique a few different modes of that. It's also not to define these communities. I think the day of sort of the white man's Raj and defining the tribes of India is very much over. I'm simply interested in the various sort of discourses and ways of representing and talking about these communities. And I'm particularly interested in hearing Adivasi voices themselves and seeing what they have to say about these issues. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ezra. That was really insightful as expected. It was really innovative. We really hear such kind of presenting the other neglected side of this discourse. So thank you so much. Maybe I'll start off with the question answer session by asking you directly. So should one still donate to Survival International or not?
That's putting me on the spot a little bit with Survival International. I think that they're a very interesting organization. I do think that some of what they say is quite problematic, though. One of the things that has really struck me studying, and I've never really communicated with them or worked directly with them, and so it would be something that I would be interested in doing and engaging with them more directly to try to really understand their perspective more before I answer a question like that. But reading one interview by Stephen Corey, the founder of it, he said something along the lines of, they want to draw a distinction between tribal peoples and indigenous peoples. And so they call themselves the Organization for Tribal Survival, not Indigenous Survival, because they see tribal peoples as peoples living in nature, living in their traditional villages and somehow in their, in their forest homes, let's say in Kanha, for example, in central India, and that removing these people from forests equals death for these communities, and that the tribes are the best conservationists, that etc., and that the best thing we can do is keep them in nature, essentially. And so I think there are some issues there, and I definitely think that they should at least work on their advertising material to be a little bit more sensitive. Okay.
All right, let's invite I think everybody can unmute themselves and start asking. You can ask your question directly by unmuting yourself. And we have our moderator also who joined a bit late, Dr. Sanchari Osu Chaudhary, my colleague at Flame, who was communicating with you, Ezra.
Yeah, thank you, Sanchari, for all the work.
Yeah, hello, Professor Ezra.
Hi.
Any questions?
So, yeah, if I can proceed with the question.
Please.
So I joined a bit late and probably I missed out, but when we talk about the tribal population, we always see that there is a change of ambition between the younger generation and the older generation. And I think which you also mentioned about the dance, the tribal dance, that the younger generation are reluctant to learn these new dances. But are there any other changes that we see in the younger generation with change with respect to their aspirations and ambitions?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, many young people, especially who were living in parks, uh, growing up in them, were eager to get out, to go live next to the bazaar, live in town, drive motorcycles, own cell phones, and all these kinds of things. They want to get educated, they want to get jobs. And so there is definitely that tension there. And I think there is this, question also about what does that mean for culture, right? What does that mean for community? Does somehow that mean a threat to cultural survival? Does that imperil traditional, certainly if you're driving your motorcycle to work in a store or a bank, you're not in the forest doing Bevar at the same time. But is Bevar really, or whatever forest-based livelihood, is that really the essential thing about culture? What is, endangered, what is not in that process? There's all sorts of ways to think about it and analyze it.
Right, thank you. I must say, so I read about the Baiga tribe when I was doing my bachelor's in sociology. So this is such a huge change that I'm getting to know from your webinar. Thank you so much.
Yeah. The other thing I didn't mention about the Baiga tribe in this, I just want to add here about the Baiga chalk in particular, is that the Baiga chalk has actually recently been in the news. It is the site where habitat rights have been declared by the government for the Baiga community in just the last couple of years. Previously, the community was called, in the colonial and early independence era administration, it's called a PTG, a primitive tribal group. Recently, that language was changed by the Indian government to PVTG, a particularly vulnerable tribal group. So you see just a slight shifting of the acronym there. And now Baiga Truck is being declared as Baiga Habitat. Habitat, of course, is also a term that kind of reeks of animal analogy. Usually it's wildlife that has habitats, but a tribal group is being told it has a habitat as well. And so there are, these various activists and government and media impulses to save these communities in various ways. And it's hard always to know what the right thing to do is, I suppose. But anyway, that's not really answering your question. It's something I just want to add that I didn't mention in the talk.
No, I think all these change in terminologies are actually very interesting in how the policies construct or interpret tribes.
Absolutely. There's a very famous article by a man named Adam Cooper, I believe, called "The Return of the Native," where he basically argues that all the new language around indigeneity and the term indigenous itself is just a rewriting of the old terms like primitive and wild and tribal, and it's just old wine in new bottles.
Yeah, true.
Christian Pascal, question? Oh, Janand Tiwari, yeah, go ahead, Janand. Janand, you need to unmute and ask the question.
Yeah,
Ranjit,
hello.
yeah, go ahead, Janand.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, hi, Professor Isra. And thank you so much for the such inciting talk. And I was just thinking, you mentioned about that Baiga Chak and the agricultural practices over there. So, what are your insights like how we can preserve these, traditional agriculture methods, or is there any way that we can like just find out like how we can educate the current population about those traditional practices, and we can talk about that, and we can like bring into it in the practice.
Yeah, the issue of Bevar is an interesting one for sure. So first of all, in the sort of contemporary popular pro-tribal tribal rights, indigenous rights discourse, the like Survival International calls the tribes natural conservationists, and says that they are, the tribes are absolutely essential to saving the forests. Now, if you look at the history of debates around Bevar and around the Baiga agricultural methods, going back to the colonial era, this was seen as an extremely destructive slash and burn kind of agricultural method that was destroying forests, according to the Britishers. And this started to change over time. By the end of the 19th century, 1890s, as I mentioned before, you really start to see a lot of British administrators who were starting to say, oh, actually, this is not so bad. Bevar might actually be fine for forests or even good for forests. And so the jury is still very much out about what the environmental impact of Bevar is. Certainly, it does involve burning forest. And so if you talk to, and as I have, to many Baiga and Gond in central India, not just around Kanha, I've had many say, oh, it's a good thing that not everyone is doing that anymore. There's not enough forests left for everybody to be burning down patches of it and just broadcasting millet seeds and letting them grow. It's just not an effective agricultural method. Whereas others say this is integral to our culture, going back to Elwyn and before, the legends of the Baiga, the stories of the Baiga said that the god Lingo told us that we can't use a plow cultivation will harm the Mother Earth, our goddess, and that the only cut into her breast, and instead this is why we do this kind of burning instead. We're only burning the plant life off of it. And so, even with, I guess what I'm trying to say is even within the communities themselves, there's no unanimity about whether or not Bevar is essential to saving culture, whether it's destructive, whether it should be continued in limited ways, whether it should be allowed in a place like a protected area, like a national park, like Kanha or not. There's all sorts of different views. I've met people not in Kanha, but in Pachmari, who were having a kind of dharna or protest where they were doing a Daya cultivation, Gond method of slash and burn in Pachmari, and they were all arrested and thrown in jail. And so there is, big conflict between the state and the communities over these things as well. I hope that got to answering some of your questions.
Yeah, got it. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, who's next? Anybody else? Ranjit, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, sir.
Hi.
Thanks for giving such a wonderful talk. So I would like to talk or ask about the contestations between the customary law and the state law regarding the hunting practices that was doing by the Baigas. Actually the hunting culture of Baigas and how the state game laws has resisted the huntings and how the communities were pressurized to do the hunting secretly and which gave them a tag of such as a criminal tag. So what's your insights about these contestations between the customary laws and the state laws?
Right. That's a great question. So one of the things I talk about in other articles and other works that I've done, and actually my PhD originally began as a history of hunting from below among these Adivasi communities. So I'm definitely able to speak about this a little bit, is a kind of professionalization and marketization of hunting for these Adivasi communities, where they would become employed as what I've called subaltern shikaris, and others in colonial hunting practices, where they would get paid to participate in the destruction of so-called dangerous wild beasts like tigers, where they would get paid per head to, rewards for the destruction of all sorts of carnivores and other critters. And so from the late 19th century onwards, we start to really see a change in hunting processes for those reasons, also selling what's sometimes called bushmeat to the market a little bit. There definitely are there were historically also advocates for saving tribal hunting methods most advocates of saving tribal cultures these days do not go as far as saying, oh, we should save the traditional hunt as well, and that hunting is somehow an integral component of tribal culture that needs to be preserved. Hunting in India was banned since the 1970s, writ large. Nobody is technically allowed to hunt, even though hunting obviously continues, both at elite and subaltern levels. But people like Virger Elwin, for example, thought that the way to save Adivasi culture was to allow them and encourage them to continue and keep their traditional hunting practices alive. Now, in terms of hunting today, especially around a protected area that would just be labeled as poaching by the state, it's hard to get people to talk about their hunting practices. I describe one little episode in my book where I, right next to Kisli Gate, which is one of the major gates to enter for the tourists into the park, I met an elderly Baiga gentleman who had some deer antlers buried under, some, I don't even remember what crop it was under, but under a big bunch of stuff piled on top of it. And I said, oh, look, a deer antler. And he got all nervous and tense. He's like, I didn't kill it. I didn't hunt. And I said, and obviously you didn't. This is, something that falls off a deer's head every year. It's not, they shed these things. And so it's obviously you just could pick it up from the forest floor. But even that, he was nervous about admitting that he'd been gathering deer antlers from the forest floor. So it's really only after getting to know communities and people over time that they'll start to open up with these kinds of stories. about hunting and what they feel about hunting. But that many, would talk fondly about, older generation would talk fondly about their youth and about being employed in British hunts in the 1930s or 40s, really, at that point, or probably after independence as well, because there's something that really kind of ground to a halt by legitimate hunts or legal hunts by the 1970s, as I said. I don't know if that's, I didn't really answer a question about customary laws. I'm not really sure that there's, I mean, there are various, what have often been called taboos, for example, about hunting tigers by various Adivasi communities, because of things like worship of Vagdev, but I'm not really sure about customary law as such. I hope that answered your question as much as I
Yeah,
could.
yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right. Anybody else would like to ask any question? So in general, I guess last question for today. In general, all these population communities are flourishing, growing well, doing well. What's your general overview? If short, yeah,
I mean,
useful.
I think it's complicated. I think that individuals have different assessments of it. That'll vary village to village, individual to individual, how they feel about the health of their communities. I mean, it's, I don't think I could answer it at that level, really. But there, certainly there is a lot of poverty. People are struggling in various ways. Conservation and development-induced displacement is an extremely difficult and traumatic thing to experience at times. I think there are real issues of precarity in various places. Amongst various communities and people that I've worked with, but I'm also not sure that some of the language that I discussed in this slideshow does justice to their cause or helps with it. And I also think it's very much an issue of self-representation and self-choice for these communities to decide how they want to represent themselves to the outside world, to also to other Indian community people in India and South Asia more broadly. And it's not and there's some difficult choices to be made about how to express those interests and to how to best advocate for their for their own rights and for their own communities.
All right, thank you. I guess if there are no further questions, we thank you very much, and we look forward to having you more for your future books.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
And hope to see you.
So nice to be here. So nice to be invited. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. Really innovative. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Would you like to just stick around for a second, or
sure,
we can?
Yeah. We can stop recording, and yeah, we can talk.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.